Mel Ziegler Flag Exchange. The exhibition was organized by the Frist in cooperation with Periton. Mel Ziegler Flag Exchange is on view in our upper level galleries until October 12th. The Frist Art Museum gratefully acknowledges our silver supporter of the exhibition, the Sandra Shatton Foundation. We'd also like to thank the Metro Nashville Arts Commission, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and the National Endowment for the Arts for their continued operating support. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few reminders. Time permitting, we'll take questions from the audience at the end of the conversation. Please submit your questions via the Q&A feature anytime throughout the presentation. And thank you in advance for your patience with us as we present this program tonight online. In the event of a technical difficulty, we'll pause the presentation and we'll work quickly to resolve the issue. If you're having technical difficulties on your personal device, please use the chat feature to send a message to Frist IT. Now it's my pleasure to turn things over to the Frist Chief Curator, Mark Scala. After introducing the exhibition Mel Ziegler Flag Exchange, Mark will be joined by Ken Paulson, the director of the Free Speech Center at Middle Tennessee State University and the former editor-in-chief of USA Today. They'll discuss the history and untold stories of the US flag. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you, Megan. Let me move. Let's see. For some reason, it's not moving off of this slide. There. Oh, getting ahead of myself. I hope many of you in the audience have had a chance to see this exhibition in person. It's one thing to see it online, but to be surrounded by those flags and all their color and their beauty, and even the torn, misshapen quality of some of them is extraordinary. It's a very emotionally powerful exhibition. I'd like to introduce you remotely to Mel Ziegler. Mel is a professor of the Paul E. Schwab Chair of Fine Art at Vanderbilt University. He is known and renowned really as a social engagement artist. He's an artist who, as you can see from his quote, doesn't really spend that much time in the studio. His studio is really on the open road. He loves to travel around the country. He's very, very interested in making connections between rural America, urban America, between different classes, trying to find common ground, trying to find a sense of community. And this comes, I think, a little bit from his own background. He was born and raised in a farming community in Pennsylvania, but went on to get his art degrees at the San Francisco Art Institute and the Kansas City Art Institute. So he's an artist who's long been interested in some of the issues that are really coming to a boil right now. I have to say that I can't imagine a more prescient exhibition than the one that we have on view through October 12th. So I do hope that if you haven't been to see the show, that you will come to see the exhibition in person. But I'll tell you a little bit about it and how it all came about. When sorry about this. It's a very unresponsive PowerPoint. There we go. Twice again. So if you read Mel's quote, you know that he travels around the country and looks for artifacts, objects that has some sort of resonance, some sort of power that trigger a poetic association, but that tells him and that enables him to convey to us something about his perception about the country. And so this is an earlier work from 2010, Rock Hard Individualism. And he was just interested in the fact that he kept seeing rocks with these faces in them. And he thought it would make a great composition and a very kind of sincere and direct reflection on one of the core characteristics of the American character, the American identity. During his travels, he started to notice, he always noticed a lot of American flags hanging everywhere in front of people's homes, small businesses, car dealerships, schools. He was taken by the fact that many of these flags were in incredibly bad condition. This is one of the first flags that he collected from Tennessee. You can't really tell, but the white stripes are actually where the cloth has rotted away. So you're looking basically at a series of holes in the wall behind it. So it's a pretty remarkable thing, and it I think inspired Mel to ask himself, well, what does the flag really mean to people? Why is the flag flown almost everywhere? It's obviously a sign of patriotism. If it's in front of a car dealership, it may be a sign, it may be just a kind of a commercial purpose. But there are lots and lots of reasons that people fly the American flag. So he got the idea of traveling the country and starting to collect flags. And so he ended up going to all 50 states with a suitcase full of flags. And he made a bunch of different trips from 2011 through 2016. And anytime he saw a worn or torn flag that looked like a good candidate, he would stop and talk to the owner, get permission to exchange the flag. He would give them a new flag of the same size as their old flag. And I think that for Mel, being a community engagement artist, at first the idea was that the art itself existed in this exchange, in the conversations that went along with it, the introduction of his work and his artistic concepts to a cross-section of people around the country. But he soon realized that this is something bigger than that, and to collect all 50 flags and to document the process of collecting them, to document the stories that went along with the acquisition of the flag. And some of the people were very, very grateful, like the woman in Hawaii who actually climbed up on the roof and helped him take the flag down. She was so appreciative. Mel particularly loves this photograph because of the red, white, and blue trucks in the foreground. You know, sometimes those fortuitous instances really help convey the story in a powerful way. Or in New York, this is a very poignant story. He went to collect the flag in New York and he saw it in somebody's yard and knocked on the door, and the woman who answered said that he was welcome to take the flag. And her son said, but this flag was the last flag that our dad installed before he died. And so the son didn't really think that this was a good idea, but the mother said, this is the way to remember him. This is the way to honor his memory. So it's a really, really poignant connection that is made with the flag. So the flag as an artifact is also a window onto people's lives. He ended up framing that because it was in very poor condition. And that's something that Mel is very, very conscious of. The idea that he doesn't want people to think that he's disrespecting the flag by showing flags that are in such bad condition that they're falling apart. So he actually ended up collecting one from McDonald's instead. Or the dealership, the car dealership in Massachusetts, and basically an auto mechanic, not a dealership, sorry, an auto mechanic's garage, that he was going to swap out one flag, but he ended up swapping out 4 flags. So again, lots of stories. This was an immigrant who had made this business for himself, and to get a cross-section of America in this way, I think is extraordinary. One of the things that I'm always impressed with in Mel's work is the sense of courage that it takes to actually go out of your bubble, go out of your circle, go into the world, knock on doors, talk to people, get a response. Don't necessarily try to convince people of anything, but just kind of have engagement, have interaction. For Mel, that was critical between 2011 and 2016. And then after the election of 2016, he thought it became even more critical to have this nonpartisan dialogue about what the flag means to people, which is essentially a question of what does being an American mean to people. All 50 flags have been displayed. This is at Federal Hall in New York. It's an extraordinary exhibition. One of the things that most of the venues that have displayed the flags have also seen the installation as an arena for public commentary, for public discourse. So at Skidmore, the Tang Museum in Skidmore, they had political debates. They had poetry performances and musical performances and people reading essays and just a wide variety of types of engagement, community engagement. Again, very nonpartisan, open to civil discourse. This is something that we had hoped to do at the Frist Art Museum, but of course COVID-19 prevented that. I just thought you would like to see this last slide. That's Mel on the left and his family at the Sandhills Institute in Nebraska. And this is an institute. Mel is a farmer as well as a rancher, as well as a university professor. And this is an institute that is dedicated to encouraging dialogue between artists and creative people and ranchers and farmers, again, to overcome the gaps that are really plaguing this country. So it's an extraordinary body of work that Mel has produced over the decades, and I think that the flag exchange itself is something of a real culmination for me of a lot of his ideas and a lot of his efforts. So here's what it looks like at the Frist. It's kind of sad not to see a bunch of people around it. You see, we set up a stage with 2 chairs, and the chairs are empty, and that emptiness may signify the fact that there's nobody there because of COVID, but it also is an invitation. It's an invitation for all of us to come and sit in the chairs. So that is the story of Mel and Mel Ziegler and the flag exchange. And I'm going to turn it over to Ken now. And I think what I would love to ask Ken to start off with is this question of just the emotional power of the American flag. Every time I go into the galleries to see this exhibition, I've seen it dozens and dozens of times, and I'm moved every time. I find it to be extraordinarily powerful, and I want to walk through it. I want to look at every flag from every state and just get that feeling of warmth, of nostalgia, of connectedness. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing, and I don't think I'm the only one to feel that way. Ken, do you have thoughts about why Americans do feel this strongly about the American flag?
Certainly, Mark, and let me thank you up front for this conversation. As a charter member of the Frist, I'm delighted to be a part of this. And the exhibit is astonishing. I've walked through that, have the same experience you've had. There's something about that flag that really connects with the soul of America, and this tells it all. I think there are a number of reasons our flag is more vital to Americans than perhaps in some other countries. I should mention now that I'm not a flag expert by any means, but what has happened in my research of the First Amendment over the last 25 years, time and again, there were intersections between the flag and civil liberties and free speech and freedom of religion, and I've always found it to be a fascinating story, and I'm delighted to share some thoughts with you here today. I think the nation, first of all, America is fairly young. It's a relatively new nation as these things go. And it's a short enough period that this generation of young Americans know the story. There's nothing arcane about Jefferson and Washington and the boys and how this country became a new nation. The legends are clear to people. The stories are compelling. And this is also a unique nation in that it was founded on freedom. This is not generations of royalty. This is about a country that said, we're breaking away from the mother country. We are going to establish a new nation. And at the heart of this nation is going to be this set of liberties that make our people more free than any others. And so I think it's natural for us to have a special affection for a nation that first and foremost put us at the forefront, that basically said being an American means freedom, and this is a symbol of that freedom. So that explains a lot. I think another thing to keep in mind is that this flag has grown with us. You know, the initial flag was 13 stars, 13 stripes, because we had 13 states growing out of the colonies. Now it has 50. Throughout our history, it has grown. There have been additional stars added to the flag. It is a living document. And in that regard, it has a currency that I think a lot of other nations flags do not. Now, I will share this with you. The most surprising thing in my research of this is how little Americans cared about the flag in the very beginning. Initially, the flag was seen as a way to mark our ships. It had purely military use, and it was a flag called the Continental Colors, which I think we can share with you here. That was adopted in 1776 at the direction of George Washington, who had it hoisted on January 1st to mark the birth of the Continental Army. And it's kind of interesting when you look at that. We all recognize the red stripes and the white stripes, but that's a Union Jack, the symbol of Great Britain there, our mother country. And what that symbolized was that this emerging country still had great affection for Great Britain and great affection for the crown and the tradition of English law. But they didn't care at all for Parliament, and they hated what they saw as Parliament's, thumb on the scales of America. And so this is an interesting compromise. This was, we are new, we are fresh, we are an emerging nation, but we still love the mother country. That was not to last, by the way. Shortly after that, in June 14th, 1777, this became the American flag. It is 13 stripes, 13 stars. June 14th of that year, this became the new and enduring symbol of the nation. What's fascinating about this, though, is that as Congress met to decide to approve this flag, they devoted all of 10 minutes to approving that design. So just one more sign that there was no special emotional attachment to our flag in the very beginning. We're now accustomed to debating whether an athlete should kneel in front of the flag to show discontent with the direction of America. If you had kneeled in front of this flag in 1777, only thing would have happened is people would have come over and asked if they could help you up. This would not have been a political statement then at all. So it took literally 80 years for Americans to buy in really deeply to the flag, and then they did big time, and it became an object of adoration really for a generation of Americans and more. I've lost your audio. There we go.
Betsy Ross was sewing this flag together. Did she submit a proposal to Congress, or how did the Betsy Ross thing fall into place?
The Betsy Ross story, and there she is with our founding fathers. I only wish this story were true, and it's sadly a fable. If I went in front of the Frist and I had a big screen TV and I said, you can win this TV by identifying the person who designed the American flag. The first person in line would say Betsy Ross. The 100th person in line would say Betsy Ross. Probably the 5,000th person in line, because this is what we've been taught. This is a legend we've heard. Yeah. And no one would go home with a television that day or any day. Betsy Ross was a seamstress in Philadelphia, well known in certain pockets. I mean, she had a business, and that was really progressive for a woman of the era. She had her whole family there. She had a shop operating out of her house. And we know she sewed upholstery, and later we know she sewed flags of all kinds, because that's what a seamstress did. But an interesting thing happened about, it was actually 1870. This woman no one had ever heard of, that no founding father had ever mentioned or written about. Her grandson, a gentleman named William Canby, went to a historical commission, a meeting in Philadelphia, and made the argument that he knew the truth about the flag, and that it was in fact his grandmother, Betsy Ross, who would not only sew the flag, he said she designed the flag. And he presented a paper. He said, there's no documentation, but I have family tradition. And it was readily received. It was a story that proved to be compelling in America in 1870, so much so it literally went viral. And do you have any idea how hard it is to go viral in 1870? What drove it was a couple of things. One thing was it was a charming story, and Americans love charming stories about their country. And a sweet woman does her thing, contributes to America's birth, and it's just a really lovely story to share. The second, interestingly enough, is there was a strong movement in favor of feminism, too strong to call it feminism, women's rights. In 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, there was a gathering of women for the first time to say, we actually need a vote, we need equal rights. And those who opposed that for women, particularly after the Civil War, they saw in Betsy Ross a story that they could share with children, their young daughters. Here's a woman who didn't have a vote. She wasn't in public office. She was a woman who, through the most basic skills, the most basic domestic skills, in this case sewing, could make a real contribution to America. And so that became a rallying cry, and it became something that led this story being shared. Now, the other thing is that by the 1890s, this story became so popular, this painting was rendered. It won the painter $1,000 for creating an image of a historic event in Philadelphia. And so that's why so many people feel the story is true, because they've seen it. They've seen images of this, and seeing is believing. So there's no truth to the story, and it just happens to be an American legend. There's no evidence whatsoever that she either sewed or created the flag in any way.
It's so interesting to me that even then, the flag or the information or stories swirling around the flag had kind of an external political dimension. That it wasn't just about this charming story, that it was actually about something much larger and much more impactful on the entire country. And of course, we see that with monuments today, with other political symbols. They become weaponized in a way.
The flag touches hearts and minds, and that's handy when you're trying to make a political point.
Yeah, absolutely. So who exactly did design and create the flag?
I think maybe the coolest founding father of all time, and I'm embarrassed to admit that I didn't know about him until just a few years ago. There he is. That gentleman, Francis Hopkinson, is, according to experts who study this in detail, most likely, almost certainly, the creator of the flag, and the evidence is very, very strong. He was immensely creative. This is a man who was, in addition to being an artist and an attorney and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, may have been the first American-born gentleman to write a song and have it published. That was in 1759. It was a song called "My Days Have Been So Wondrous." It has never made the Billboard charts, but it was popular at the time. And he's also credited with writing the first American opera back in 1781, a work called Temple of Minerva. So this guy is just a ball of energy and passion. And so one of the reasons we know he was probably the guy who did the flag is he billed Congress for it. He sent them a bill and said, for my work on patriotic images, including the design of the American flag, I'm asking you to give me a half cask of wine. And they turned him down. And they turned him down saying, a lot of people have contributed their ideas to the creation of the flag, and we don't feel like we can credit any one person, which, first of all, is very cheap of them, but secondly, really tells you that the Betsy Ross story has no grounds whatsoever. And anyway, this gentleman is overwhelmingly believed to be the guy. He also worked on the United States seal, and his contribution was a red, white, and blue shield, and strikingly similar to the flag that was designed. So what we've seen, it's Francis Hopkinson who is really the father of the flag.
Well, I hope he was paid for the seal, if not for the flag. Just
Yes,
imagine what that half cask of wine would be worth today. It would be worth at least $5,000.
And what it would taste like. Yeah.
Probably not so great. So you've already mentioned that the flag was used on ships and military installations, People didn't have a particularly powerful sentiment toward the flag early on. When did that start?
Well, the first glimmer of affection for the flag actually came during the War of 1812 and 1814. There's a gentleman, Francis Scott Key. I'm sure he's familiar to many.
Yeah.
He played a unique role in the War of 1812. It turns out he's also an attorney, and I don't know how many scholars of the War of 1812 we have in the audience, but the truth is we were getting clobbered by the British. So much so they marched into Washington, D.C. They set fire to what we now know as the White House. They cleaned up. And then there were some rogue British soldiers who actually went into, I guess what you call the suburbs now. But they would ransack houses and take goods away. And Francis Scott Key had a good friend, a guy named Dr. Bean, who led citizens to try to curtail this activity. And they actually captured some of these rogue soldiers, but then in turn were captured by the British troops. So off goes Dr. Bean and his colleagues, and they go off with the troops, and the troops having essentially conquered DC, they're going to Baltimore, to Fort McHenry. And on their march to Fort McHenry, and they're on by this time they're on a ship, as you can see. They are about to bombard McHenry, but before then, Francis Scott Key shows up to try to get his good friend Dr. Bean released. Good negotiations. He gets him released, but he can't leave the harbor. The British are saying, no, you have to wait until our battle is over. So there is Dr. Bean and Francis Scott Key sitting in the harbor on a boat, unable to leave, and all they can do is watch the British guns attack Fort McHenry. And night after night, they assumed McHenry would go down. And the final day of the barrage, it's clear that the flag is still there. Francis Scott Key writes a poem about the attack and about how joyous he felt when he saw that the flag still stood. And this, of course, is a poem that we now know as the Star-Spangled Banner. He brought this poem to newspapers, which published it, and suggested that it be sung to an old tune called Anacreon in Heaven. Anacreon was the ancient Greek poet for love and wine, and this was a song sung by drunken revelers throughout the colonial years and into the 19th century. And that became the melody. A drinking song became the melody for the Star-Spangled Banner, which is really appropriate when you realize that most of us sing the Star-Spangled Banner today with a beer in our hand at a sporting event. So that all comes together beautifully. But that's the first time Americans really on a wide scale were touched by their flag. And so largely that was also forgotten. The Star-Spangled Banner was forgotten. But it and the flag became newly popular when the Civil War broke out. And so after years of not really caring about our flag, suddenly the Confederates had a flag of their own, the stars and bars that we still talk about very much today. And that encouraged Americans to embrace their own flag. And the flag became a symbol of unity and the way it, in their view, used to be and should have been. And so that launched Flag Mania. And from that point on in American history, we are very close to our flag. We care a great deal. And increasingly it becomes something you see outside of homes, you see it outside of businesses. Before that, it was largely ships and military installations. So that's when the flag became important to us.
Was it about the time of the Civil War that the Pledge of Allegiance was written, or did that come later?
No, that actually came in the 1790s.
Whoa.
And interesting period. 1790s may be the most patriotic decade of our nation's history. Here you see an article from the Youth's Companion, which was sort of the weekly reader for kids of the 1890s, I should say. And what had happened is media came along. Suddenly, packaging got sophisticated, and people began using the flag to wrap their products in, figuratively. And there was a great movement, a tremendous nationalism in the 1890s. And part of it was actually anxiety about immigration. We began to see large numbers of immigrants to this country. And by this time, the people who had lived here all their lives or for 50 years, they felt pretty much like native-born Americans, of course, and all the others were interlopers, a familiar theme in American history. Anyway, a very ambitious company and publication, Youth's Companion, decided they wanted to sell as many flags as possible. And they also wanted to sell subscriptions to their magazines. So they could make a buck selling flags, and thought, here's what we need to do. On Columbus Day, 1892, we need to celebrate Columbus Day by reciting the pledge. And we'll write the pledge, which they did. And then there it is. That's exactly as it appeared in the very beginning. And they made a small fortune selling flags, and it created again this fascination with the flag and a movement to get flags in every school in America. Before then, didn't exist, but this organization created a way for little kids to ask for a nickel and pennies and raise a lot of money so they could sell them flags. This is the original flag, and you might notice it's not the same flag we pledge today. There's some key elements that have changed. And if you just read that, I pledge allegiance to my flag. That's what it was in the beginning. But again, the immigration concern led it to be written to say the flag of the United States of America. So no little Italian child would be thinking of Italy when they should be thinking about the United States. That was the reasoning. And the republic for which it stands. One nation, and there's no under God, we'll get back to that. One nation, indivisible. So what that is a civil war. It's only 30 years after the Civil War, and they're saying one nation, indivisible. That becomes part of the pledge because of the Civil War. And then with liberty and justice for all, the author, Mr. Bellamy, who wrote the pledge, said came from the French slogan for the war, the French Revolution, which emphasized liberty and justice and fraternity. So we're just diagramming the Pledge of Allegiance. Every sentence had its purpose. The change came, one nation under God is actually very recent, 1954. And that was during the height of the Red Scare. And those of us in the audience who are old enough to remember the 50s know that there was great anxiety about Russians, about the communists, and they were commonly described as the godless communists, godless commies, and every politician made sure they were as godly as possible. And that included a resolution to add one nation under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. So to your point about our flag traditions being tied to political incentives, that's absolutely it. This is our pledge, which is, rightfully revered by Americans, was actually a sales gimmick by a magazine, adjusted because of concerns about immigration and adjusted because of concerns about communism. It doesn't have the richness of a founding father having crafted it.
No, but I think the ambiguity of the whole thing, the idea, especially its relationship to immigration. Columbus Day, wasn't Columbus Day sort of begun around the same time as the pledge, and Columbus Day and Columbus Circle and the statue of Christopher Columbus were all sort of conceived in the late 19th century as a way of encouraging Italian immigrants to feel welcome and to vote basically in their new country.
Right.
And I love the fact that some of the people that Mel encountered on his trips around the country were also immigrants, probably first generation immigrants. And that love for the flag, the need to sort of use it as a way of expressing your love for your new country, I think is an extraordinary phenomenon.
This pledge, by the way, you mentioned Columbus, it was essentially tied to the 400th birthday of Christopher Columbus. And although our thinking about Columbus has certainly changed, it's interesting that at one point he was essentially tantamount to a founding father. And that's the treatment he got, and why we celebrated that as a national holiday.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about the changes to the pledge over the years. Have there been other changes, or are we kind of caught up?
To the flag itself is essentially been
to the Pledge of Allegiance.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
We are caught up. Now, what's interesting is that when they added one nation under God, it was clearly a reference to faith.
Right.
The nation was facing tough times, not economically. The 50s were good by and large, but it was just a concern. I mean, people built bomb shelters in the 50s and 60s. And a minister in New York actually gave a speech talking about the need for America to embrace the Lord. And that resonated. So there's no question in the 1950s, when they said one nation under God, their intent was to embrace God. And you also know that our nation in the First Amendment has an admonition, separation of church and state. This was clearly an embracing of church. But every time this gets challenged, the Pledge of Allegiance gets challenged as an act of a violation of the Constitution, judges always say, no, it's simply a tradition. I mean, they do that with "In God We Trust," which is our national motto. They just say it's a tradition, historic tradition. It's our national motto. It doesn't mean God. So that battle continues. The most fascinating stories involving the Pledge of Allegiance actually involve Jehovah's Witnesses. And before we had one nation under God, the interim version of the flag was the subject of critical litigation that led in 1940 to a major Supreme Court decision. Jehovah's Witnesses were uncomfortable. Children were uncomfortable reciting the Pledge of Allegiance because you go back and look at the language, I pledge allegiance to my flag. Well, that sounds pretty literally like you're pledging allegiance to a piece of cloth. They were fine with pledging allegiance to the republic for which it stands, but they felt that this was a violation of their faith to pledge allegiance to an object. So they challenged what was then mandatory. The Pledge of Allegiance had gotten so popular, people forgot its origins as a magazine gimmick. And they said, okay, let's make sure that all students in every public school recite it. And that's what happened. It was a law. When Jehovah's Witnesses objected, and in this case, 12-year-old Lillian and 10-year-old William Gobitis, they were suspended for refusing to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 1940, in an 8-1 decision, overwhelming decision, in a case that's called Minersville School District versus Gobitis, the Supreme Court sided with the school district and said, we understand people have different beliefs, but we need order in our classroom. Our nation needs patriotism. You have to remember this is right on the cusp of World War II. And some citizens have to sacrifice some liberty because unity is paramount to this nation. And it's a value that overrides the belief of those children. Then something that almost none of us had ever heard occurred, something horrendous. This unleashed this wave of bigotry against Jehovah's Witnesses all over this country. And a mob of 2,000 marched on a Witness Kingdom Hall in Kennebunkport, Maine, burned it to the ground. There were Jehovah's Witnesses assaulted. One example of a town gathering them and tying them around a flagpole, spitting upon them, assaulting them. It's been estimated more than 2,500 cases of harassment against Jehovah's Witnesses occurred, and some were even lynched. All apparently ignited by the Supreme Court decision. The justices who decided that case were horrified by what had been unleashed. And there were, I think, 2 changes in the Supreme Court. And then came something that is just so historic. The Supreme Court began sending messages that it would like to hear a similar case again. And that's exactly what happened in 1943. A case called West Virginia State Board of Education. In that case, similar, almost identical facts. And in that situation, the Supreme Court reversed the earlier decision of just 3 years ago, 3 years earlier, 6-3. And they concluded that students couldn't be forced to salute the flag or say the Pledge of Allegiance. Actually, it was broader than that. You know, you'd think this decision would have been based on freedom of religion, but in fact, it was based on freedom, largely on freedom of speech. And the conclusion by the Supreme Court makes eminent sense. It says government can't make a citizen, and young people are citizens, say what they do not want to say. You cannot compel speech. You can't force an oath. You can't force any pledge. You can't force people to salute, and you can't force them to say what they don't want to say. And that's still the law. So that 1943 case is pivotal and a huge blow in favor of freedom of speech. Ever since then, in theory, students have the right not to say the Pledge of Allegiance. I said the Pledge of Allegiance every day. No one told me I didn't have to, but I didn't mind. And that's been much the thing that's occurred for decades. And then occasionally, a student will say, I don't want to say the pledge. And if the school is at all informed, they say, that's fine. You can just sit quietly. There's no problem at all. That's the way the law works. And the 1943 decision still stands.
That must be some kind of record for the Supreme Court to reverse itself in 3 years, to basically admit that it was wrong.
I've never seen anything like it.
Yeah, yeah. And I hope all the attacks on Jehovah's Witnesses immediately stopped.
There's no record of that occurring afterwards. I mean, I'm sure there were individual cases of bias,
Right.
but the epidemic of attacks certainly declined after that.
Yeah, yeah. And that question of coercion versus, maybe peer pressure or something, it's saying the Pledge of Allegiance is something that you may, understand that you don't have to do it. But if you don't do it, then you'll feel as if you are somehow, targeted or ostracized or being disrespectful or unpatriotic. It's really interesting to think about that in relationship to other forms of expression that the Supreme Court has deemed to be protected, like flag burning.
Flag burning is another huge part of the First Amendment history of our flag. By the way, before we move on, I just want to mention, because I know we have Nashville audience here, during the Nixon administration, there was a real wave of flag waving. It's the height of Vietnam. And Life magazine distributed the Reader's Digest distributed 49 million flag stickers inside Reader's Digest. And John Prine, who was a mailman before he became a legendary songwriter in Nashville, was one of the guys who had to deliver those. And they'd fall out, and he's picking them up all the time. He told the story often in concert. And he ended up writing one of his most prominent songs a couple of years later, A Flag Decal Won't Get You to Heaven Anymore. So the flag also plays a role in the history of Music Row.
Yeah, I don't think it's telling on Mel Ziegler too much to say that Mel's dream for this show was to have John Prine come and sing that song at the Frist.
Oh, wow. Well, that would have been most appropriate.
And we lost
so
John
sorry.
Prine. It's very sad. But that song is a fabulous song.
So the flag burning. So for most of the history of most of the past century, flag burning could be prosecuted. But what's interesting is where flag desecration laws began. And I've mentioned it a couple of times, 1890s. The 1890s, we get the Pledge of Allegiance written. We've got the classic painting of Betsy Ross, and we have laws that are intended to prevent advertisers and manufacturers from using the pledge in a tacky way. That was the purpose of flag desecration laws. And they were upset because every can of beans was wrapped in flags. And people were upset mainly because urinals had flags on them. Every possible kind of household product had a flag. People felt it was just cheapening the flag to have it on all these things. And so a law was passed, a state law, and it grew. The idea was we got to prevent offensive use of the flag. Well, during the height of flag burning in our country, the law's on the books. And so it's relatively easy for prosecutors to say, well, if you burn a flag, that's just for special treatment of the flag, and we can prosecute you. And those prosecutions occurred in all kinds of ways in America during the height of the Civil War, the Vietnam War, a distinctly different war.
Yeah.
People were prosecuted for wearing the flag as a cape. They were prosecuted for wearing the flag as pants. And they were prosecuted for wearing the flag as a patch on their jeans, particularly if the patch was on their posterior. Those are all real live prosecutions where people did jail time. And the irony of that is you look at the way people dress today. There are flag bathing suits. There have always been flag leisure suits, golf suits, or whatever it happens to be. These are, you just go to any store. I saw one in Kohl's the other day that was literally I didn't see it in Kohl's, I saw it online, and it's shorts, red, white, and blue shorts of the flag, and then a jacket. I have no idea where you'd wear that, but if you'd worn that in 1970 at an anti-war protest, you would have been prosecuted. And then, of course, the real prosecutions, the serious prosecutions, came with flag burning. It's interesting. We're unable to get a show of hands from our audience here, but I'd be curious as to how many have ever seen a flag burning. I certainly haven't. I've seen television and video. It's not as common as most people think, but it does tend to occur most often in a time of great stress when there are a lot of protests about our foreign policy. And the pivotal decision in this goes back to 1984, the Republican National Convention in Dallas. A flag was burned in front of Dallas City Hall, and demonstrators were charged with a Texas venerated object law, which, interesting, the elements of this law, you had to mistreat the flag in some form. Didn't say burn it, just mistreat it, and in a way that seriously offended others. So if you burned a flag or danced on it, heaven forbid, if no one saw it, it was perfectly permissible. Interesting law. What happened is everybody was charged, and they all pled guilty, got reduced sentences, except one guy, Gregory Lee Johnson, who fought it in court. And that led to the pivotal case in 1989, 5-4 ruling. Couldn't get any closer than that. Supreme Court said, what does somebody do when they burn a flag? What is the purpose of burning a flag? Well, you're criticizing the government. You're saying, or the country and its policies. It's very clear. You may view burning a flag as malicious, but the purpose of that is to send a signal to other people that you're really unhappy with something that's going on in America. And the court looks at that and says, now, if you said that verbally, you're protected under the First Amendment. If you wrote it down and distributed it to 1,000 people, you're protected by the First Amendment. And they concluded that this was no different, that this was an expression of political will, and that that we shouldn't give the government the power to jail somebody for objecting to the government's own policies. So I'm sure there are people in this audience today who don't agree with that. That has remained the law. The only way you could ever overturn it is, first of all, for the Supreme Court to decide otherwise, but to have a constitutional amendment. And that's how you would change that, because the Constitution says you can't, the constitutional ruling says you can't jail somebody. You'd have to write an addition to the Constitution that said, but flag burning is impermissible. And most people are reluctant to go to that extent because flag burning is not that common.
Megan Russ did a wonderful presentation on the flag in American art, from Jasper Johns' Encaustic Flag to Dred Scott's piece, This is how to show the American flag. And I think that question of free speech and artistic freedom those are paramount. Well answered, I think, in the court of public opinion. So I guess we've flown through about 240 some years of the American flag. Where are we today?
Well, the flag remains
the flag today.
Yeah, the flag is an extraordinarily potent symbol today. It is revered now as much as ever been. And by the way, scholars tell us that no nation in the world loves its flag as much as we love our flag. It's more ubiquitous here. It is the center of our politics. We just saw 2 political conventions. Flags were everywhere. The flag is alive and well. And of course, most recently, we're seeing debates about whether professional athletes should kneel during the Star-Spangled Banner, during the national anthem, with the flag flying. A lot of people talk about that and say that it's being disrespectful, and those who are protesting are saying, we've got to get your attention, and we're not happy with what's going on in America. So, you know, the flag is just profoundly important to this country, and still something that people react to on a very emotional level. We have covered all that territory, and I think I've shared every key Supreme Court case with you involving the flag. I would just sum up by saying that the true glory of the flag is that it represents the most creative, the most powerful, the most ambitious and dynamic country in the history of the world. And it's not a coincidence that this is a nation founded on freedom. That symbol stands for freedom. And we have to be careful that as we honor the flag, that we don't sometimes lose sight of the liberties. And that's when we've had the battles in court. I would not be so presumptuous to rewrite the Pledge of Allegiance, but I wish they had written it just slightly differently and just said, I pledge allegiance to the republic founded on freedom and the liberties for which it stands. That would have solved a lot of problems and said exactly the same thing. So thank you for your time and conversation today.
Well, this has been great fun, wonderful conversation, and I've learned a lot. I don't know if we have time for some questions. If there are any questions, Megan?
We have one so far, and if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A, and we'll read those out loud. Bonnie asked about the first flag that we showed, and she noticed that there were only 11 stripes. Ken, do you know why there were 11? Were there only 11 colonies at that point, or?
No, I don't think that's significant. I think it's the dimensions of the flag, and I don't think it was intended to be. I don't think it was intended to be symbolic at that point.
Got it.
There is an East Indies flag from 1690 that is almost identical to that, including the British symbol. And so I believe they were just. My theory is they were committing some form of flag plagiarism, and I'm not sure that was symbolic. But you know what? I'm going to go look that up.
All right.
Good question.
Mary asks, do you think that Ziegler, or by your curation, Mark, created this installation either directly or indirectly as a response or critique of the Dred Scott installation?
You know, I don't really know the answer to that question. We can ask, I think Mel might even be listening, but I don't think so, because Mel was very, very careful to ensure that anybody presenting the installation follow the flag code, that we don't allow it to touch the floor, that we display it with the blue field and stars to the left. And you know, so we had to follow the code precisely. And he has said several times that it was important for him that people not see his process or his selection or his transformation of flags into works of art as being in any way disrespectful. I'm not saying that Dred Scott's work was, but it's a very, very different way of thinking about the American flag, I think.
Well, and for those of you that are unfamiliar, the Dred Scott work, the flag is laying on the ground, and part of the installation, you may choose to step on the flag to view part of the installation. So I think that's very different in that, it's kind of provoking, is this something that I want to step on or not? Whereas, Mel and the team that installed the exhibition at the Frist, I think we're very careful not to do that.
Thank you for the question.
Someone asked, do you find that some regions of the country fly the flag more than others?
Well, I certainly wouldn't. I wouldn't be an expert on that. Mel would be, because he traveled to every state. I think there's kind of a universality of flags in schools and government facilities. I'm not sure it's geographic, but I'm certain it's timing. Come election season, those flags go up everywhere. That's peak season.
Yeah, I think Mel would definitely be the one to answer that question. One of the things that I looked for when I looked at the flags was to see if there was a variation in the condition of the flags. Like if flags from the West were more worn than flags from the Northeast or something like that. And, quite honestly, I couldn't tell. And I'm not sure what conclusion you would draw from 50 examples. It's a very small sampling. It's interesting that there was an artist visiting from Serbia recently, and she talked to me about her surprise at seeing American flags everywhere in Nashville. And for her, the flag was a symbol of ultra-nationalism. And so she assumed everybody flying the flag was an extremely nationalistic person. And I tried to, talk to her about that and talk to her about the difference between, why one person will fly a flag as opposed to why another person will fly a flag. And, what time of year is it? As Ken says, if it's in the political season, there are different reasons. So it's a really interesting question, how are these, are there patterns to the display of the flag?
You look at those, the flags that Mel put up, you're just thankful he got them down. Some of those are terrible. How could anyone have kept a half cut off flag on exhibit? So he did a public service in addition to creating art.
Well, many of the people were very appreciative. They had noticed the flag had worn, but they didn't have the ability to take it down or didn't have the money to replace it. And so I think that was, part of the really heartwarming aspect of the story. Mel sometimes went to great lengths. The cement or asphalt company in Oregon, where he had to climb up this very long set of stairs and then, harness himself and wear a hard hat. It's not a matter of just pulling on a rope and bringing the flag down. There's actually some physical risk involved.
Someone commented on the monitor in the galleries that displays the stories of the flag. I worked on that project with Mark, and Mel was generous enough to share the stories of each 50 state with us. They noticed that it was in alphabetical order, and I just wanted to add that we actually changed that because of COVID-19. It was originally a touch screen where you could click on the map and the state would display, but because of the need to remove the touch aspect of that, we put it in alphabetical order. So we have one last question I think we have time for. Flags as a form of team, country, people identification is an interesting development. Do we know when and where flags became a thing?
That's a great question. No, it goes back centuries. There are, including like ancient Greece. There have been pieces of cloth that have been symbolic, literally for centuries. It's not a new thing, but it's never been more popular than today. And obviously, one of the things I found fascinating about researching the Betsy Ross family is they had a cottage industry throughout the 19th century, selling little mini Betsy Ross flags. So she didn't design the first flag, but her family created the commercial business of selling flags, and it's still alive and well.
I only wish John Prine could have met Betsy Ross. Now that would have been a conversation.
Maybe they're having that conversation right now.
Let's hope so.
Well, thank you so much, Ken. Thank you, Mark. And thank you all for joining us this evening. We appreciate you spending your night with us. Please visit our website, fristartmuseum.org, to purchase your reserved time ticket and come see Flag Exchange in person. We are open, and you're able to come in and see the exhibition in person. You can also visit our website to learn more about our virtual programs and to sign up for our weekly email newsletter so you don't miss out on the next one. Thanks again, and I hope everyone has a great night.
Thanks, everybody. Good to see you guys.